Okay, welcome everyone. So I'm really delighted to be chairing this debate and to introduce Emma Pearson. So Emma is our speaker today and is going to be talking about the detention estate and compassionate alternatives to it. Emma works for Justice First, which is an organisation based in Stockton and Middlesbrough, and delivering legal aid and advice across the region. So Emma is also an activist with No to Hassock Field, working on campaigns about advocating for people who are in detention and ending detention centres, because as you'll hear from the talk, there are compassionate alternatives. So I'm going to hand over to Emma.
Thank you, Marcy, and lovely to meet you all. I'm very glad to be here today. I'm going to try and share my screen, hopefully without any issues. Um, Please let me know if you can see my screen. I've got it up there now. Yes, great. Okay, so as Marcy says, I am going to be speaking about immigration detention today. I've heard from Marcy that there's been a few speakers in the past talking about migration. And migration issues. So hopefully I'll bring a new perspective talking specifically about immigration detention, which is a practice that the UK government use within their
Oh,
immigration and asylum system. I'll
do we
also be
know?
talking about, sorry, was that an accident or? I'll just continue. Yes, I'll be talking about resistance on a local and national scale and compassionate, workable, cost-effective alternatives to detention. So what is detention? Detention is an administrative process rather than a criminal justice process. It's a procedure that the government use to detain people who are seeking asylum, refugees, and other migrants for administrative purposes, not criminal justice purposes. Um, so detention centres are centres with prison-like conditions, so people do not have freedom of movement. They are held in there for indefinite time periods. So unlike prison, when people know when they'll be released, people within immigration detention do not know how long they will be held in there and when their release will be. Um, Often, immigration removal centres are located in quite rural areas of the country. So, for example, there's a detention centre in County Durham called Derwentside Immigration Removal Centre, which is very hidden away, essentially. And unfortunately, it's not the only one that's in quite a rural part of the country. So they are called immigration removal centres, but I'm going to be referring to them as detention centres because it's a minority of people who are actually removed from the country following detention in these centres. So they're mostly used for detention purposes rather than removal purposes. Um, and anyone who is subject to immigration control could be at risk of being detained. Whether that's someone who's arrived in the UK by irregular means, someone who's potentially overstayed a visa. There's numerous factors in which someone could be put in a detention centre. So, in terms of detention within the UK, I think it's very important to contextualise this that the UK is the only country within Europe to use the practice of indefinite detention. So, whilst detention is a common practice across Europe and the world, the UK is the only country in Europe to not inform people about how long they will be in there and when they will be released. And it's a very common practice for people to be moved around the detention estate from one detention centre to another, and also people to be moved from the community back into detention, from the community back into detention. I have personally met many people who've been in detention on numerous occasions and then placed back into the community. I've put some stats on here from the Home Office website and a great source called the Migration Observatory, who release statistics on migration and detention. So as you can see, it is large numbers of people who are being put in the detention estate, but the most common reason why people are leaving is not removal from the country, it's bail. So as you can see, in 2021, 86% of people who left immigration detention were released back into the community and not removed, which already raises questions about what the purpose of these detention centres are. If they're not actually removing people, why are people being put in these centres, traumatized, held under prison-like conditions, if they're ultimately being released back into the community? And then you can see in 2022, that statistic was even higher. So in terms of the costs of detention, so I'll be talking costs in terms of physical cost, financial costs, but also the human cost of detention, which I also think is very important. So detention is a significant expense for the taxpayer. Just going to move you all so I can see my slide. Um, as you can see, oh, sorry about that typo there. In 2022, it was approximately £107 per day per detainee. And in that same year, over 24,000 people were detained. Now, if you put that into the context of the statistics on the previous slide about how many people are ultimately released back into the community, that statistic is quite significant and raises again a lot of questions about what is the purpose of this? Why are we using this as a tool in immigration control? Given so many people, majority of people are released back into the community. Often, when we talk about the cost of detention, it's that overall cost of keeping someone in there. But there's so many other costs that need to be considered and contextualized here. So when someone is in detention and they are applying for bail, there's legal costs about for bail application, for bail hearings, appeal hearings. For people who've been wrongfully detained and released back into the community, the government may have to pay payouts for wrongful detention. There's the costs for health services and provision of other service, religious services, things like that within detention centres. Compensation, as I've already mentioned, for people who are unlawfully detained. There's the significant cost of transporting people from one detention centre to the next and escorting people to removal flights, which often don't end up taking place. And then obviously there's the staffing costs, the facilities costs. So as you can see, detention is a significant cost to the taxpayer to run these immigration removal centres, which are not serving their purpose of removal, which are simply re-traumatizing people, essentially. So really, the cost of detention is much more than that stat of 107 per person per day. Slide. Obviously, there are human costs as well, which I think should be the main thing that we are thinking about here, because in the end, we're talking about human beings that are being moved around, being put in and out like yo-yos. So detention is extremely traumatizing. Let's not forget that many people who come to the UK to seek sanctuary or who are here on another migration route have already experienced some form of trauma and being held under prison-like conditions, many of whom have no criminal convictions, often causes or exacerbates mental health issues and physical health issues, as well as keeping people separated from their communities, from their loved ones for indefinite time periods. International and national organizations like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, all talk about the significant human cost of detention and how there's often human rights breaches involved in detention facilities. When we're looking at social integration, obviously migration is a very divisive topic and it's been causing a lot of issues as we've seen recently. By keeping people in centres like these, rather than encouraging community cohesion, are we actually contributing to integration problems? And also keeping people in detention facilities like these is preventing them from accessing things that they are entitled to, like good quality legal support, because the legal advice within detention centres is notoriously underfunded and hard to access. So, as well as the physical financial costs of detention, there are significant human costs of detention. And I've heard many stories from people who have been released who talk about the significant challenges that they experienced whilst they were held in these centres and the challenges they continue to face after being released. I just wanted to kind of contextualize this further by providing two anonymized case studies of real people that I've come across to give you an idea about what's actually happening. So the first person was a man that I met who was from Libya, who'd lived in the UK for a number of years. He was a refused asylum seeker with no criminal record who had been struggling to access legal advice given the ongoing legal aid crisis and lack of funding into legal provision. He had been placed in and out of detention more times than I could count on my hand. Moved between detention centres as well as between the community and detention. However, there were significant barriers to his removal. The Home Office physically couldn't remove him because he did not have travel documents and he also had significant health issues, which meant he was not fit to travel. Yet the Home Office were refusing to grant him any status. So I would encourage people to think about, well, what do we do in that situation? Why are we detaining people who the Home Office physically cannot remove? And how do we manage people who are in this situation? How do we support people who are in this situation? And then another person more recently, this woman's story has been widely reported, so many of you may have seen it on the news. But this is a woman who has been living in the UK for over 18 years, who had also been refused asylum, who had been making attempts to regularise her status. She had British family members who were living here and had fully complied with her bail requirements, so reporting to the Home Office. She was suddenly detained without warning after over 18 years and held in detention for a number of months. In fact, she's still in detention now. In this time, she's been transferred between detention centres and she's had two cancelled removal flights, given she has strong legal arguments to remain in the UK and is actively getting legal help as we support. Though she is still in detention, and has been since March, I believe. So again, why are we detaining someone with deep community ties and no flight risk? What are we achieving here? The Home Office are clearly struggling to remove this person, and in the meantime, she's being re-traumatized significantly. So, with all that being said, I wanted to talk a little bit about resistance to immigration detention. So, hopefully, I've given an overview about why detention doesn't serve its purpose and why it's an unnecessary cost and expense to the taxpayer and why it's unnecessary and re-traumatizing. So, what next? So, I'm going to talk a little bit about resistance and then I'm going to talk about alternatives. So, what can we do instead of detention? So resistance obviously can take many forms, and this list is by no means an exhaustive list. There are other forms of resistance that I haven't been able to put on this slide given limited time. But legal challenges, grassroots movements, public actions, civil society, public advocacy. Resistance can take many forms. There are lots of people working to challenge detention through different methods and through different techniques, some of which is direct action, getting there out there and protesting, like what we do through No to Hassockfield. Some people are seeking to influence and push for policy change. Some are academics writing and researching about detention. We've got people who are holding vigils and faith forums, as well as legal professionals trying to challenge detention in terms of breaches of human rights and so on. So resistance, as with anything, can take many forms, but the fight against immigration detention is definitely a national effort, and there's many groups, organizations, and individuals who are advocating for more humane alternatives across the UK. So I just wanted to talk briefly about No to Hassockfield, which is the campaign group that I'm part of, which is very much a local campaign group. However, we do work nationally. We work nationally with other organisations and campaign groups across the UK. We are specifically campaigning against Derwentside Immigration Removal Centre or Detention Centre, which is in County Durham, so it's very local to here. And Derwentside is a detention centre with a capacity of 84 people, and it's the UK's only detention centre which is exclusively for women. So the majority of other detention centres, I actually think I've missed a slide on where here's the slide on where the detention centres are. So as you can see, they are spread across the UK. But as you can see, most of them are for men. Some are for men and women. However, Derwentside in County Durham, the blue dot at the top, is the only one that is the centre just for women. Just go back to the No to Hassockfield slide. Yeah, so we campaign to close Derwentside Immigration Removal Centre because of all the arguments that I've already said, but we believe that the location of Derwentside makes it particularly cruel, given it's in an extreme remote area of County Durham, which means it's hard to access for people's family and friends, community support. It's hard to access for people's lawyers. There is extremely poor phone reception, which might sound like a small thing, but when you are in a detention centre trying to advocate for yourself and needing to contact your legal representative and keep in contact with your family, having access to good phone signal is essential. So we have been in existence since before Derwentside was opened, when the plans were first announced in 2021. And initially, we campaigned against the opening of the detention centre. However, when it unfortunately opened, our campaigning efforts shifted to campaigning for its permanent closure. I think it's important to say that Derwentside is actually in the former Medemsley uh, training and Hassockfield secure training. So I think it was Medemsley Prison and then Hassockfield Secure Training Unit. So it's a site of significant historical trauma as well. And many people locally remember the trauma that people had experienced there, and now that trauma is ongoing. And we've always advocated that the site could be used for something which brings hope and prosperity to the area, which provides jobs for locals which aren't built on the inhumane detention of people who are already vulnerable. Um, so we hold regular protests outside Derwentside Immigration Removal Centre, and again, people might question the effectiveness of protests, but we know that women in there can hear us, and so they know that people are there in support and in solidarity with them. It also puts pressure on local politicians, and the centre management. And it's part of a national fight against detention. So this is very much a local action, and here's some photographs of our actions, obviously, but we are part of a much wider national fight against detention. So what could actually be used then as an alternative? I guess that question is probably going through some people's minds. If we don't have these centres, what next? How do we support and manage migration if we don't have detention? Well, I'm going to talk very briefly about two projects that I've run, which served as alternatives to detention, and then other options. The first pilot study was one which was held locally in the Northeast, and this was one called Action Pilot. It ran between 2019 and 2021. Many of you might have heard of Action Foundation in Newcastle. So this was a project run between, sorry, that's a typo. That shouldn't say King's Armed project. It was between Action Foundation and the Home Office, and essentially it provided housing, holistic support, and legal advice for people who had previously been detained in Yarlswood Immigration Detention Centre, and it provided them with the same sort of support but in the community. So instead of placing people within a detention facility, it put people in shared housing. It provided people with hands-on support work and casework and access to high quality, free legal advice, which was all holistic. 20 people took part in this study, and it took place over 2 years. In terms of the stats, they found by the end of this project that it cost less than half of the cost of detention to do this pilot, so it was significantly cheaper. It was more humane and ethical. People had better outcomes for their case because they had access to better quality legal support than they did when they were in detention. And people had better understanding of the legal system. So, all in all, this project showed that there are workable, more cost-effective, more humane alternatives to detention, keeping people within the community, so long as there's that other support available. Then there was another pilot project called the King's Arms project, and this ran between the Home Office and UNHCR. This one was specifically around like legal advice. So people who were put into this study had to have a stable home address. So this study didn't provide people with accommodation like the Action Foundation pilot, but it provided free legal advice for people who were referred in by the Home Office, essentially. So this study was also significantly cheaper than detention. So as you can see here, it was approximately two-thirds cheaper to manage people's cases this way than within detention facilities. 80% of clients who took part had been offered viable options to regularize their immigration status. It improved well-being, trust in authorities. People had better understanding of the legal systems to advocate for their own rights and therefore have better case progression. So again, showing that there are very viable, workable alternatives to detention. However, both of these projects obviously had their flaws, and there are more pilot schemes needed. And the question is, how do we actually roll more pilot schemes like this out on a bigger scale? Because both of these were very small projects. In terms of other current alternatives, none of which are perfect, obviously. There are community-based case management things, as we've just talked about. Um, People use bail. So many of you have probably heard about immigration reporting. That is something that currently takes place where people are left within the community, but they regularly have to attend Home Office buildings to show they are still complying with the legal system, essentially. There are obviously electronic monitoring, so tagging, um, residency specifications, and there's the voluntary return programs. I'm not going to go through all of these in detail because of time constraints, but as you can see, there are criticisms to all of these, none of which are by any means perfect. Some things which are potentially worth considering more. Sponsorship systems, legal support programs, trauma-informed hubs, mobile clinics for legal advice. There's lots more things that the government could look at exploring more and investing in. Um, but the problem is the time and the money that's needed to go into rolling out these programs. I'm also not naive in thinking, I'm not being naive and I'm not being idealistic that it is going to be a challenge. So ending detention is definitely something to aim towards, but there are other questions which need more thought. And I've just put these questions on, which are questions that I don't have the answers to, which I believe are questions which still very much need further consideration. And I think they're difficult questions which, do need to be thought about whilst we're advocating for complete reform of the migration system, which, as we all know, is entirely broken. So, as Marty said, like we give legal advice at Justice First in immigration and asylum law, and we do meet people very regularly who have exhausted legal avenues to remaining in the UK. There is no legal channel at present in which they can remain in the UK. So for those people who also can't be removed given the significant travel barriers, as I said with that one person I spoke about earlier, how do we manage and support those people? What does the government do in that situation? For people who have committed criminal offence, of which some people in detention have committed a criminal offence, should prison sentences be enough? Is putting people in detention a double punishment? And then if they go on to be removed, is that a triple punishment? Are deportations necessary? And if so, do detention centres need to exist in order for deportations to be carried out, or can people be left in the community? Um, are there any circumstances in which detention is necessary? So are there some groups of people for which detention should still take place? And I think the big question is, will the government actually ever abolish detention completely, or is it part of the wider hostile environment to try and deter migration? And if detention centres are abolished, will that encourage more migration? I don't think so, but these are just bigger questions which are part of the discussion, really, which I think are things that need further thought. Um, but I believe that is the end. I think I timed that very well.
Thank you so much, Emma. That was really interesting, and yes, indeed, very well timed. So, yeah, I'd like to invite any questions that people would have for Emma. You can pop them in the chat, or you could also raise your hand and I can call on you to speak them out loud if you would prefer. Yeah, so I can see a question from Caroline. Go ahead.
Can can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
My question is, what hope in hell do we have of this government or any government setting out on a more humane course in view of the torrent of abuse that any more compassionate political action would draw from the right-wing press? My sense, looking at oh God, what's the woman's name? The Home Office Minister is called, Marcy, help me.
The current one.
Yeah,
Oh,
it's just the name's gone. Anyway,
Home Secretary,
Yvette
Bet
Cooper.
Cooper.
yeah, yeah.
Yvette Cooper just looks so uncomfortable speaking on this topic.
Mm.
I'm just terribly pessimistic about the chances of anybody doing anything on a broader political scale, given the dog whistle that that any such action would attract.
Mm. Yeah, thanks for that, Caroline. I often find myself feeling hopeless, to be honest, so you're not alone there. But I think conversations like this are super important, and sharing of accurate information and the statistics. I mean, obviously, we know we're living in a cost of living crisis, and it's often the most vulnerable people, like migrants, who are scapegoated, who are blamed for austerity, who are blamed for the country's problems. And actually, if we look at the sheer amount of money that's being used unnecessarily in things like detention, well, why then can't the government find the money to offset energy prices to ensure that everyone can heat their homes? These are all political choices that the government is making. There's money there that they could be spending elsewhere if they closed centres like these, but they're choosing not to. And why is that? Because it fuels their rhetoric that migrants are the problem, that migrants are to blame, that if we stopped migration, there'd be more funding to do this and do that and do this and do that. So I think having more conversations within the community, breaking down those stereotypes, that misinformation, and encouraging people to go and speak to their councillors, their MPs, to tell them what's happening. Because, I mean, through No to Hassockfield, that's some of the work that we do. We go and speak to MPs, and even MPs don't know about the money that's being spent on detention centres. So I think if more MPs were also raising questions within Parliament, it would put more pressure on the government, in terms of how they're spending their money. But we must not lose hope, that's for sure.
Yeah, so I can see a question from Joe Fisher. So if you'd like to go next.
Okay, thank you. I was thinking as you were talking about prisons that we have in this country, which of course, again, we have so many and it's so expensive. It's what, something over 50,000 a year for each prisoner. It's also, I was just thinking, do they have access to phones where they can ring out to Samaritans, which they have now in a lot of prisons? And they have obviously listeners. I don't think that would be developed, but I just wondered that.
Yeah, so when someone is put in detention, they're given a very basic phone, to which they can make phone calls. But as I said with Derwentside specifically, there's significant issues with phone reception. And you have to wonder, was that intentional? Did they open up Derwentside in a very remote area of the country, which would be hard to get to, which they thought maybe activists wouldn't mobilize in because it was out of sight, out of mind, basically, and where they knew it would be hard for people to access proper legal advice and get community support. So I know with Derwentside specifically, the phone reception has been a real problem. So yes, people do get phones, but they're very basic, and yeah, there are problems with that still.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I just wondered if they had pay phones or something like that, or do they have any money? Because
Well,
that's a question.
I
But
know that there's support groups. So, for example, with Derwentside, there's a visiting group who go in and visit people in detention. That's called Durham Visitors Group. And they go in and provide emotional. They're always looking for new volunteers, by the way, if anyone's interested to go in and visit in Derwentside. And there's also a group called Friendship Across Borders, and they take physical items, SIM cards, welcome packs, if you can call them, or friendship packs for people who've just been moved to Derwentside with essentials in, like toiletries. And I think they do provide SIM cards as well for women who've been, or money at least for SIM cards. I know that a charity called Women for Refugee Women as well also used to, I don't know if they still do, provide money for SIM cards for phones. Um, so it's very much also charitable support. Yeah.
thank you.
So I can see there's a question from Andy in the chat. So I'm going to read that out and then I'm going to come to you, Daphne, for a question, if that's okay. So Andy is asking, is there any evidence that asylum cases are being dealt with more quickly under Labour as they promised?
Um, I don't know the answer to that, to be honest, Andy, but what I can say is that it seems like the Labour government has really upped detention and is really trying to up removals. So that anonymised case study that I gave before about the woman who'd been in the UK 18 years, you do have to ask why suddenly, after 18 and a half years, have they thought we're going to target this person now, after she's been engaging with the Home Office for all this time, why suddenly now are they targeting her? And I can also say, like, in my work, we are seeing so many people who are having their claims wrongfully decided. So the recent wave of refusals is Afghan men. The Home Office is refusing asylum claims for all Afghan men, unless you are in a very specific group of people. So either you're LGBTQ, you are a woman, you worked for the Afghan local police, you worked for the government within Afghanistan. They are outright refusing your claims, which is crazy, right? Because we've been told for decades that the Taliban are dangerous. It's widely reported about human rights violations and the security situation within Afghanistan, but they're refusing all of these claims. And then, of course, there's further cost to the taxpayer as well because of the appeals process, which will go on. And I guarantee most of those people will probably end up being granted anyway, because how can the government actually remove people to Afghanistan, really, given what's going on? So I don't know the answer to your question, but I definitely wouldn't say that it's been more positive since Labour have gone in, unfortunately. I would maybe even say the opposite.
Thank you. So yeah, we'll take the next question from Daphne.
Thank you, yes, and a very interesting talk. My understanding is that the number of people who come here legally is far outweighs the number of people who come illegally and therefore presumably are the ones that are in detention centres. So if we kind of pointed this out, would that help the people who are coming illegally if they're seen as an absolute minority that is, you know, trivial in terms of the population and the demands on services and all the rest of it?
I think it's important to say as well that the government also detains people who've arrived by legal means. So anyone who's subject to immigration control could be detained. So you could be detained on arrival to the UK. If you've arrived by plane and they suspect you of using a fraudulent document or potentially not having the right visa, you could be detained. If you've overstayed for a small amount of time, you could be detained. So it's not only people who are arriving by irregular means who are being detained in these centres. I think the key thing to talk about is the number of people who are being released, and they're being released because they should never have been in detention in the first place. They're being released because either the government cannot remove them, physically cannot remove them because there's significant barriers to their travel, or because they have a legal right to be in the UK. And that's for people who arrived by regular means or irregular means. So yeah, I think rather than putting regular migrants and irregular migrants over another, because that's sort of again, how do I say this? Alienating and fueling the kind of rhetoric that we're hearing about irregular migration. We should be talking about how it's everyone who's subject to migration control who could be detained, and in fact, detention is completely unnecessary. Yeah.
Thank you, Emma. We've heard a few questions about sort of hopeful alternatives. And as you were speaking, I had a couple of thoughts about that that I just wanted to ask as a question. So you mentioned the projects that were sort of the pilot projects about providing an alternative, either through community support or through legal aid to those who already have stable housing. I was wondering sort of why haven't those alternatives been extended beyond the pilot? And I suppose as a related question, what do you think would give politicians the will to actually put in place these kinds of compassionate alternatives?
Thanks, Marcy. I think the answer is probably because of how time consuming they are. So these pilot projects obviously took a lot of planning. There was a lot of people involved in them. They took They were run over a few years, and if you look at how few people took part compared to the time it took to plan and facilitate these programs, I guess that's probably a reason why they haven't been rolled out further. And I think the fight against detention, obviously, in an ideal world, we will get rid of all detention centres in the UK, but it could be a gradual thing. And I think most people don't even know about these pilot projects, first of all, that they even took place and what the outcomes were. So I think the first step is actually talking more about them, sharing the news that these pilots took place and these were the outcomes and this is how cost effective they were. And they were operated on such a small scale. And if we use these elsewhere, imagine what could happen. So I think that's the very first step, is actually talking about these, going to our MPs and speaking about these pilot projects that have been ran and were proven to be more effective, both cost effective and more humane and ethical. And then from there, again, hopefully MPs can then go to politicians and say, well, there are these proven alternatives that have been used. So why can't we roll out more programs like this? Why can't we seek to close one detention centre and use these community-based alternatives? Instead, the government is trying to open more detention centres. So I don't know how many of you have heard of Campsfield in Oxford. So that was successfully closed down previously, and now the government is trying to reopen it again as a detention centre. So actually increasing the detention estate rather than trying to work against it and invest in these more humane, more cost-effective, community-based alternatives to detention. Sorry, I feel like that was not a very good answer to your question, Marcy, but I think the answer is that people don't know about them. They were very small, very local, and we need to be speaking about them more, to be honest.
Yeah, yeah, and I think so recently there's been some suggestions in Parliament. So I know that the MP for Sheffield Hallam raised a question about having a safe passage visa, which seems to have gone no further than her question. So I think I guess it's like you were saying in your answer, but do you think it's about trying to improve people's political will and as well as knowledge?
Yeah, and I think advocating to not put groups of people above groups of people, you know, it's like everything that's happening right now with trans rights. We're talking about already the most vulnerable people within our society. Migrants have experienced significant trauma. Why are we blaming them for the significant issues that are happening within the UK when these are political choices that governments, not just the last government, the current government too, are making, and they could be choosing to spend the money elsewhere, but they're not. And that is not the fault of migrants, that is the fault of political choices.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll take the question from Joe. Another question from Joe Fisher.
It was just as you were talking, reminded me of the workhouse, which is what these are, in fact, in some ways. And of course, the workhouse eventually closed down because at last governments found that they were too expensive to run and it was cheaper to have people in the community. And I'm thinking that took a long time. I don't think we as a country have that amount of time. It has to be quicker than getting rid of, I mean, the workhouses were still in operation right up to the Second World War, but they knew it was too expensive. There was a cheaper way. So your particular
Yeah,
would
yeah.
be absolutely good at if that can be evolved. And I think as soon as you were talking, I thought this is workhouse again.
And I think, oh, sorry for interrupting you. I was just going to say that I think, again, it's the information. So when I've spoken to locals around Derwentside Detention Centre, many of whom are reform supporters, they completely believe, because they've been told so, that these immigration removal centres are removing everyone. So that these centres are full of illegal migrants who've got no right to be here, who are all criminals. And these centres are great because people are put in there and then they're deported which is absolutely not the case. And I think if people actually realized who's being put in there, why, that majority of people are released, that actually these are so expensive for the taxpayer, they wouldn't really have any leg to stand on to be making these arguments. But the problem is they're being fueled, this rhetoric, by politicians, by the media. So it all comes down to this community education and having these conversations and breaking down the narrative and the rhetoric that were being fueled. Because I think if more people realised the reality of what was actually happening and how the government was choosing to spend money, they would realise that migrants aren't the problem here and that these centres don't need to exist.
It's
And you
like
can understand why people feel like that. If they're being fed hate, then they will feel fear. And what do you do with fear? You blame people. And you can't blame people for that. It's just where community education comes in and conversations like these.
yes. Well, it's the same with prisons.
Hmm.
Or talking, oh, they've all got to go to prison. I'm
Hmm.
going to stop because Jim is looking as if he wants to talk.
Yeah, Jim.
Yes, thanks, Emma. I think it, I think it's, excuse me, I'll come back.
Do you want us to come back to you, Jim?
No, I'll try again.
Okay.
I assume that I know that the local authority has very, very little control of what happens with, for example, at Hassocfield, even though it's in their area. But I just wondered if any existing help which the local authority has been offering is likely to be adversely affected with the change of government in Durham to these kind of issues. I just wonder whether you have any views on that.
So what I do know is the previous MP was MP Richard Holden, who was a Conservative MP who has now been moved to a constituency down south, but he was very much pushing for the opening of this centre. Since the boundary changes, I hope I'm not wrong here, Liz Twist is the MP for Derwentshire, and she is obviously the opposite party. I think politicians, MPs, and councillors, most are aware of what's going on, and some are sympathetic, but not many are being vocal about this. Not many are being outspoken and consistently putting pressure. There was a few MPs, like Kate Osborne is one, for example, a local MP who had been put, and Mary Foy, MP for Durham, who had been putting a lot of pressure on the government around Derwentshire, but it's certainly not enough. And again, there's been some local councillors who've been involved, but again, not consistently and not putting enough pressure.
Yeah. Can I just follow that a little bit? Can I assume that there's no children involved at present have been detained?
Well, children are detained in detention, not at Derwentshire, but
No.
children are detained. There is policy on how long children can be detained, and in practice, it should be like a last resort. Basically, if someone's got an imminent removal flight, they could be detained up to 72 hours before. But I don't know if any of you have seen, like, it's awful, the detention centres where children are held, like, there's big mural paintings on the wall, and it's like you're putting children in a prison, essentially. Those mural paintings are not going to make this any easier for them. So unfortunately, children are detained. And there's also, I mean, this is a whole different topic, but the whole topic about age assessments as well is a huge issue. So people who arrive in the UK as unaccompanied children who tell the Home Office, I'm 15, 16, and the Home Office assess them to be 23, 24, 25, and then put in detention centres is a huge problem too. The whole age assessment system is completely broken as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think maybe it's worth mentioning that actually, like, there are so many problems with calculating age, especially when in some cultures they don't measure age in exact calendar years. And some people may not know how old they are. So as part of education on that, maybe like making sure that people are aware that just because somebody doesn't know their age doesn't mean that they're lying or they have a false claim or something like that.
And they often do it based on physical appearance as well, facial hair and things like that, which is crazy as well, that you can determine someone's age by the facial hair that they have.
Wisdom teeth, which mine
Yeah,
when I
exactly.
was 15. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Is there any more questions to follow on? Yes.
Yes,
Steve.
can I ask you, what happens to the people who are let out on bail? Where do they go? Do they get any support? Is there a significant cost for people who are let out on bail?
So people have to have a bail address before they'll be released, and this is also another issue. So people could have their bail approved, but could be kept in detention for further weeks, if not months, if they don't have a bail address to be removed to. So essentially that could be family or friends, or if someone has got an active claim ongoing, then they need to wait until there's Home Office provision for accommodation. So again, that is a big problem too, which does come with extra costs because people may have their bail hearings granted by a judge, but then actually are kept in detention much longer than they need to be because there isn't that availability of housing.
I think Hugh had a
Thank you.
question. Yeah.
Yes, thanks, Emma, for that. I mean, everything you said makes total sense in terms of the detention system, the cost of it, and so on. I was thinking if I was an MP, I would be faced with two separate issues, if you like. One is the flow of immigrants into the country and the stories we see for people coming from Cali and elsewhere. And that's one issue, which is how do you address the question of people smuggling, why people have to come in the first place. What you've addressed is the other part of the issue, which is actually when people are here in centres like this, all of the stuff you said makes total sense. The trauma, the craziness of the cost of it. And so I was thinking how to separate, if you like, in the narrative, the media, those two issues of there's the flow of immigrants is one thing, and that does has to be addressed. There are certain things that have to be looked at in the way it happens, why it happens. But then what you've addressed is that whole issue of the cost and the efficiency and the impact on human beings who could be a really valuable resource into our economy, for example. And we know we need younger people. I wondered, I have the feeling that Germany has done a better job. Obviously, that huge influx of refugees that Angela Merkel allowed in at a certain point. They seem to have had a system of whereby people can very much more quickly get into language learning, into work, and so on. Has any of the work you've done or your colleagues have done looked at that? Because I'm wondering whether there's some good cost information in there and method information in there that would influence MPs on that one side of the issue that you've really addressed.
I don't know personally much about Germany because I've usually looked into places that are doing it wrong. So obviously many of you have heard about Nauru probably with Australia. They used offshore processing. And when the whole Rwanda debate was going on, obviously we were advocating against that, the offshore processing of people, because it was essentially using the same detention system but elsewhere. So I don't really know much about Germany, if I'm being honest. In terms of separating the argument, that's a really big thing because I think the rhetoric that people like to use is that there's huge amounts of people coming here by irregular means and that these detention centres are necessary to put all those people in and we're going to remove them by mass. That's the rhetoric that people are hearing. So it's all part of the same system when it's not actually like that in process. And again, I keep saying it, but I think informing people about the reality. And the problem is there's so much biased journalism happening, and journalists are afraid to cover positive stories or neutral stories. So that woman that I was telling you about earlier, who'd been in the UK 18 years, when all of this has been going on, we were reaching out to journalists, even including The Guardian, and editors were against covering the story because of potential backlash for covering positive migration stories or even neutral, migration stories. So it's really hard, but I think having conversations like this, talking about the reality, the costs, the trauma, proven alternatives in the UK and abroad, and yeah, encouraging people to not believe the negative rhetoric and stop scapegoating the people who are already the most vulnerable within the community and within society, essentially.
Yeah, thank you.
Our next question is also from Andy Cooper. So Andy asks, what do you feel about the prospect of Reform becoming our next government?
Oh, I don't even want to think about that, to be honest. It's really scary. Yeah, I can't even comprehend that, to be honest. I mean, even hearing about what's happening now with LGBT flags being banned in council buildings and trying to ban EDI workers, like it's just the most scary prospect. I take hope in the fact that my cousin works for the civil service and she works in Darlington and she's now under reform and apparently it's utter shambles. No one really knows what's going on and there's no clear policies and apparently it's chaos. So you can only hope that people realize that a lot of the things they're saying are not workable at all, and are not. It's sad that they have to get in to be able to realize those things. And I don't know what the answer is, to be honest. I think it's a real shame that migration is covered in such a bad light within journalism because there's so many positive stories and there's so many positive contributions that migration has made throughout history and will continue to make. And just more conversations like this are needed, really. Yeah, sorry, I don't even want to think about that happening, to be honest, because that hopelessness I was talking about will probably come out in full force.
Yeah, I think it's a very real fear that you're describing there. I think we're probably going to have to make that our last question, I'm afraid, because we are just coming up to 12 o'clock. But thank you so much, Emma, for answering all of those questions. I'm just going to close with a reminder of our next debate. So our next debate is on Saturday, the 24th of May at 11 a.m. at St. Mary's Church Hall. It's with Maeve Cohen, who's from the New Economics Foundation. And Maeve's subject will be, do we need a new economy? So yeah, it's the final debate of the series. So the final debate is after Maeve's debate, sorry. And that one will be with Michael Clark on Saturday, the 28th of June at 11 a.m. On Zoom. And the subject will be of current security issues. Thank
you everyone for having me.